Welcome, everybody. This is our third session of In the Lab with an Expert. If you had been part of some of the previous ones, this is what you'll know. This is a platform that we've been building to try to help bring some of our technical resources and the expertise that they've got, people like Matt here, to a wider audience, with the goal being to help as many of our customers and non-customers, as many folks out there, understand the technologies that Alchemy works in as possible. If you don't know who I am, my name's Adam Crossett. I'm the staff consultant with Alchemy. I've been here just about a little over 4 years at this point. Been working in technology for the better part of 2 decades now. Everything from higher education, vendor services, partner services, manufacturing, sort of all across the board. I'm going to be the sort of the avatar for everybody out there, right? I have a lot of legacy infrastructure background, and that's sort of the perspective that I've got on this. Today, we're going to be talking ADC NetScaler 101. To that end, we've got my colleague Matt Roth on here. Introduce yourself, please, sir.
Yes, Matt Roth. I'm the managed service architect for Alchemy. I've been with Alchemy now for 3.5 years or so. Citrix certified expert in FDS, NetScaler. I've been doing NetScaler now for over a decade, it seems like, definitely. And just VAR and consulting for a number of years, right? So yeah.
Now, Matt and I have had he's had the distinct mispleasure of working for me here, I think, for working with me rather, for a whole lot of years now. We worked together with some previous partners and all over the place prior to Alchemy, right? Yep. All right, so again, we're going to be talking about ADC here today, and there's a lot of stage setting I want to do at the outset, because it's such a big conversation that we could be having about NetScalers in general. So first, from a scale perspective, not to disappoint too many people. So NetScalers can be used obviously all the way up to like the ISP class, right? So you can have ISPs running these things to do traffic management. That's not the world that we really specialize in at Alchemy, nor is it the target from a scale perspective that we're going to be having for this conversation. We're going to be shooting more, what we say, Matt, from like that 10 to 10,000, sort of that small, medium, and small enterprise.
Yeah, more of that line of what our line of business is, right? Like, okay. Yeah, the NetScaler ADC. I started when it was still called NetScaler way back, even when PBS was part of Ardent's, right? That whole thing. NetScaler and ADC. It took me a year to get comfortable in it, and because I came from a Windows admin / Citrix admin background when I first started. NetScaler ADC consulting and work on that, it took me a whole year to get comfortable with it. So I totally understand where people are coming from and why we wanted to do this, right? Is that we've got our standard Citrix admins that are handed this appliance, don't know what it does.
It says Citrix on it. This must be something you can do.
Right, exactly. And they get it and they're like, well, what is this? This is a network appliance. I don't know what to do with this. And you're right, it's daunting, but there is a lot of things that it can do, right? It can do load balancing. It's your gateway for all of your Citrix stuff. It can do authentication. There's the SSL VPN built into it. There's a layer 7 app firewall, right? So you can do, IP reputation, bot reputation, cross-site scripting checks, all of that built into it.
So then, all right, so stepping back real quick. So then in terms of the people who are going to get the most benefit out of this, right? So like we mentioned, we're really targeting the people, the Citrix admins who, congratulations, today you're now an ADC administrator because it says Citrix on it. So to be people who have got a pretty minimal amount of knowledge around ADCs, NetScalers, why they're called what they are. If you already are an absolute black belt with ADCs, to be candid, you're probably not going to get a whole ton out of this particular webinar. Now, like we said earlier, right, huge topic. And we're definitely going to do more of these with Matt to really dig in. We even got some questions that came in ahead of time that are a little more advanced than we really want to get into in this particular session. So if you do have questions as we're going through this, right, because it is a huge topic, we're going to keep all the questions to the end, which is a little different than how we've done it previously. We're going to keep all the questions to the end, and any that we don't get to, we're not ignoring you. We're going to keep them specifically for the next session when we are going to get into some more technical depth. There's a little QA button down there at the bottom of the webinar. Please use that. It helps us keep track of all the questions very easily. Don't throw them in the chat. If you put them in the chat, we're not going to see them. But if you put them in that Q&A, gives us a record of them and lets us go through them really easily. All right. So as Matt was saying before, right, very big picture, the two things we want to cover here today, we want to talk ADCs and then we want to talk ADMs. So we'll put ADM second because ADC is what it says on the box here, right? So you covered this a little before, Matt. I just got a NetScaler. I just got an ADC. A high level, what is this appliance likely doing in my environment? Like what's the function of it?
Likely it is the gateway for your external access. It is potentially what you're using for your SSL VPN connectivity. It is load balancing, potentially your Exchange environment, right? It's storefront, a host of other applications. It's also potentially doing authentication for other things, right? Or it's also being used as a reverse proxy potentially, right? There's a ton of different things that it could be doing.
Right, so this is not just the. I mean, I hear NetScaler, I think load balancer. Those things are synonymous, sort of in my head. And obviously, a load balancer, a network load balancer, that is just one of the functionalities that we're getting out of a NetScaler, out of an ADC, right?
Yep.
Okay. So then, stepping in a little bit. And you and I did talk ahead of time a little and trying to get, my tiny brain around some of the different terminology here. We talked, VPXs and SDXs and all these different things. We say ADC. ADC is NetScaler. If we take that as a given, then what is a VPX?
Right.
And where does that sort of fit into the big Tetris puzzle of all these terms?
So the VPX is what they consider a virtual ADC. It is just like it sounds. There's a ton of different flavors of it. It's for every hypervisor for the most part right now, the major ones. It's just a virtual appliance, a virtual Linux appliance that does load balance, does everything that NetScaler would, any sort of hardware NetScaler would do, right? So the VPX is the NetScaler software itself, right? It's what actually does the load balancing.
So like in the simplest deployment, so if I'm a very small org and I've got a data center and I'm running VMware, I could just have VPXs as VMs running right on top of ESX alongside everything else.
Yep. And it would do everything that a hardware ADC would be able to do.
Okay, just obviously at a different scale, right? And that's
different scale, correct.
Okay, and so scale and capacity, just bigger picture, scale and capacity are going to be, that's going to be probably the big, or one of the big determiners when we start talking about moving between these different sort of levels of things, right? Okay.
Right. So yeah, I mean, we've got our virtual, we also got the hardware versions of it. The two different hardware version flavors that we generally run into are the SDX, which is, think of it like a service delivery model, right? And then the MPX, which is your physical hardware, your bare metal, right? So the ADC software is installed directly on like a super micro 1U, 2U hard piece of server with like an SSL card in it, right?
And those are MPXs.
That's correct. Right.
Okay, so that's sort of jumping to the opposite end from, if we've got VPXs being the very small, just the VMs that's doing the appliance doing the load balancing. MPX is that same software platform, just bare metal installed on a pizza box, right?
Correct. Yeah, for security or for performance or for whatever reason, right? Your VPXs, you can get gigantic with those too. They sell 100 gig VPXs, right? So it's all about like how much. It's all about the capacity, right? MPXs and SDXs, they share, some of those models even share the same hardware, right? It's all about the capacity and like what is needed for whatever your application is.
Okay.
Your MPX is, like we said, bare metal. It's one instance. It's just like an old school server with Windows on it, right?
Okay, except it's running essentially the VPX software directly on it. So sticking with MPXs then, so that's going to be at the much larger end of things, most likely.
Most,
why would I want an MPX if I could just deploy a couple of VMs?
mhm.
Why would I want to have to rack and stack appliances, physical boxes?
It could be for security reasons, right? It could be we have a lot of banks or people that have organizations that have government contracts that require like, I mean, that's the ADCs do a FIPS model, right? A FIPS compliant model
Okay.
where everything's secured, right? With keys and key stores and everything. Those are for our high security ones, right? We've got those. Some banks require it for PCI compliance, right? Piece of hardware for external, right? So
Okay.
that's one of them as well. One of the reasons.
What about you mentioned on the encryption side, can you get, I mean, it's a physical box, can you actually get SSL cards for MPXs?
That's the whole purpose behind an MPX and an SDX is that
Okay.
they actually come with the physical SSL chips that handle the decryption and encryption.
Okay, so you're not doing that because obviously if it's a VM, you're doing that purely in software. So you're
Correct.
going to put a
Yeah.
lot of heat from a processing perspective. Okay.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So then so if we've got MPX at one end and that's our bare metal, typically going to be for scale and security. From a functionality perspective, again, putting some of the encryption capabilities aside, is an MPX capable of doing effectively all the same stuff that a VPX is if you just deployed it as a VM? From
Yeah.
from an app functionality perspective, are they sort of the same?
You update them with the exact same firmware, so they're
Okay.
exactly the same across the board. So
Okay.
you won't, it'll be transparent to an end user unless your VPX is underpowered or some other thing is going on, right? So
Okay, so then all right, so we've got MPXs, piece of bare metal hardware. We've got VPXs, which are just a pure VM. What's an SDX and how does that sort of fold into the middle?
so the SDX is kind of both worlds, right? So your SDX is going to be a physical box with
Okay.
SSL chips in it, but it's running a separate, it's not running the same firmware. It's running Zen server, right? It's running a hypervisor
Okay.
that also runs a service VM that allows you to manage the VPX instances that live on that SDX. So think of it like
Okay.
like an ESX box, right? So you have your hypervisor lives on there, and then you can fire up instances or VMs on top of it, right? That's the exact same principle within an SDX.
Okay, so unlike the MPX, the actual VPX, the actual load balancing software is not running directly on that SDX hardware.
Correct. It is virtualized. Yeah.
Okay, so the SDX is just sort of Citrix's hypervisor platform on which you can run one or many VPXs.
Correct. Yeah.
In the same way as you would run them on another hypervisor.
Yeah, it's exactly the same way, right? They still fire up. They still run a Linux appliance. The only difference here is the SDXs have their SSL chips, and you do allocate a portion of that SSL processing to those VPXs. So, this is the beauty of those SDXs, right? So let's say you've got one that you've got 4 instances on, right? You've got an internal, external, and you've got tests of both of those, so that you can actually have your internal, external migrated or segmented traffic out, right? It's running at full tilt, and then you have your test ones that don't need all that hardware and processing, right? So that you can still do your testing, make sure everything works, but you still have your other ones that are still good.
Okay, and that's all sort of in one box. Okay.
That's all in one box, yeah.
All right, so then to span the spectrum here, so we've got in terms of what folks out there might have gotten handed, right? You could have, and just correct me as I'm going here, make sure I got this right. So we have VPXs, which are just VMs we could deploy that might be deployed into your hypervisor environment. When it be smaller scale, that's the actual NetScaler software, if you will, running as a VM. They might have that. It might have, one or more SDXs, which is Citrix's hypervisor with many VPXs running inside it, all the way up to they might have one or more MPXs, which is the bare metal, sort of the big boy version of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Do I have that right pretty much from a span perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the SDXs generally, they're the ones that are going to have the most capacity, right? So
Oh,
Yes.
more than an MPX?
Well, it depends on the model, right? So there's a ton of
Okay.
different models of all these different hardwares, but I mean, your SDXs are going to be able to run more instances doing different things, right? You're not locked into one ADC like with an MPX. You would have,
Hmm.
multiple connections into it, but the traffic is you're going to be able to segment it, but it doesn't have that line of demarcation like an SDX would, where the traffic only comes in on one port and it goes out one port, right? So that your external traffic is physically segmented off from your
Okay.
traffic, right?
All right. So I mean, because you could have, so on an SDX, you could have multiple VPXs. Could you have internal, external
Mhm.
within VPXs within a given SDX?
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. We have plenty of people doing that. Yep.
Okay. And there's no, well, I guess just like any other VM, there's not really concerns about them crossing boundary because
Especially with,
they're different
yeah,
machines, right?
exactly. And SDXs have a ton of it, depending on which model, right? They've got a ton of different NICs on them, right? So you can plug them into wherever. So
Okay.
external NICs, yeah.
In terms of sort of the HA setups that, again, I'm trying to think that people are likely to see out there, what are, for your average organization that's maybe got, large Citrix infrastructure, maybe call it 10,000 sessions, something like that. Maybe they've got, two primary data centers, in Texas. We obviously have a lot of customers in Texas. What is sort of an average, if there is one, right? And don't let me back you into a corner here. What's sort of an average deployment that you would expect to see for an org of that size in terms of what would they likely have, or what even should they have, and how would it be laid out? Assuming they don't have any, very significant constraints you mentioned, like they're not a financial, maybe it's somebody in energy, right? And they have,
Yeah, again, it's all over the place, right? It's depending on, if there's physical security requirements, if there's the segmented traffic requirements. It all depends. It's unfortunately that's going to be the answer. It's all going to depend,
okay,
and it's even going to depend on if they have virtual, if they have physical, if they're in the cloud even, right? Because the
okay.
ADCs live in Azure and AWS, Google Cloud as well. So it all depends, right? We're seeing people, we're seeing movement across the board on all the appliances. So they're still, all of them are still in play.
Okay, well, that goes to a question that popped in my head here. So do you see any of them sort of aging off? We talked earlier with MPX as being sort of the most traditional. Like if I think back 15 years ago to when I was doing on-prem data center stuff, those were effectively MPXs. They probably weren't called it at that point, but that's effectively what we had. We had our pair of pizza boxes
Mhm.
in each data center, and that's what balanced traffic. Do you see MPXs sort of going away as SDXs get bigger, or is there any roadmap around that, or they all still have a specific sort of part in the market and a role to fill?
They all still have specific parts, and Citrix has gone pretty well with combining down the models to where an MPX and an SDX can pretty much, they're interchangeable at this point. It just depends on what software you're putting on them, right? So we don't see as
Okay.
much as the MPX anymore, just because virtual's it's gotten so big, right? And people
Yeah.
just don't want to put hardware in data centers unless they have to. That being said, the SDXs make a lot of sense when you're running multiple ADC or multiple VPXs. So we see it all across the board.
So is there a if I were to come to you and I said, hey, I've got some number of VPXs deployed in my vSphere environment, right? When do you start advising folks make the jump from being VPX on third-party hypervisors to having actual SDXs to run those VPXs?
That's a good question. That's a really, again, that's one of those depends.
Like a ton of variables in terms
There's a
of,
ton of variables in
okay,
there. Generally, if we're seeing somebody move to a different hypervisor where they have to redeploy anyway, that's when we'll be like, hey, maybe we look at your capacity, right?
okay,
If you're looking and you're going to have to redeploy anyway from like one hypervisor to another, maybe it's time to start looking at hardware, right?
Okay, so you got a boatload of VPXs already on a vSphere environment. You've just bought wholly into going all Nutanix or something similar. At that point, you might evaluate and say, hey, you got an absolute boatload of VPXs. You're using the heck out of them. You should think about re-architecting this in some way, potentially move into SDXs.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially,
Yeah.
okay.
Yep. Just because then you're getting that segmented off traffic. You're not worried about resources, right? You're bringing the control back into your Citrix team if you need to do that, right? We get a lot of reports of people having issues on hypervisor because of backup schedules or migrations or whatever, right? When we start talking renewals and things like that for Citrix, you'll always see VPXs that live on hypervisor be more expensive because of they're taking on that risk when you call support of, hey, this lives on hypervisor they know nothing about, right? But when they live on a hypervisor SDX that they know, they control that environment, then it's a little bit easier.
All right, so in a way, and I mean, not being mean to Citrix here, but in a way, it removes a potential out for support to be able to say, hey, we can't figure this out. It's a mystery. We don't understand if it's running on something other than an SDX.
Right.
Okay. What does, at a high level, and obviously it's a huge conversation we could have, if I've got a handful of VPXs today, maybe they're doing very pedestrian stuff. They're doing load balancing, right? Network load balancing. And I do want to look at moving those into an SDX. How big a process is that to move those configs from VPXs, again, maybe deployed in VMware, to VPXs on SDXs in-house? What's that look like? How big a project?
It's a pretty large project. I mean, it depend on how we would do the migration, right? If we're reusing IPs, whatever. But again, that configuration itself is pretty much lift and shift, right? You can take that configuration, you just have to change IPs or whatever,
okay,
and you can move it over, right? Once you get the initial config done, right, making virtual IPs, those type of things, is not as difficult if it's on the same network segment. If you got to worry about firewall rules and stuff, blah blah blah. Yeah, we can get into that later, but yeah, it's not as hard as everyone would think it'd be.
So it's not a total. You're not reconfiguring from like the other. So you hopped on the other day with me, and we were working through setting up some really basic, some custom HTTP monitors, right? So we set those up. Things like custom HTTP monitors or all those configs, those can all be effectively backed up and restored if I'm moving from VPXs on my own hardware to VPXs on an SDX, right?
Oh yeah, yep.
Okay.
All of that, yeah. Any settings you have, we can pretty much take them, lift them, and shift them over.
Okay, beautiful. All right, so that's not actually that bad. Okay. So and we touched a little bit on this. I want to dig a little deeper. So where do you sort of put the line in terms of deciding between SDXs and MPXs? Is it purely wanting to have sort of a potentially split traffic model? Because it sounded like feature-wise, you can get chips in both of them, you can get SSL cards in both of them, and everything. What's the dividing line between SDXs and MPXs?
The MPX is going to be more of your high security stuff, right? Or if I'm going to say cost, right? Because SDXs are not cheap. Citrix loves their SDXs, and they are very, very, they're expensive.
Very proud of them. Okay.
They're very proud of them. Your MPXs will do a lot of what the SDXs can do, but not at the same like segmentation level, right? You're still going to have, but those MPXs, again, we see them, we see a lot in our banking, our compliance, our government folks using FIPS, those types of things, right?
So you mentioned it being almost more just a firmware difference. So is there a path, if I've got a pair of MPXs today and I want more out of them from maybe like a network segmentation perspective, is there any way without having to re-rack new boxes to go from MPX to SDX, like on the same physical hardware? or is it always going to be a new purchase and a re-rack?
That's a good question. I
Okay.
honestly don't know.
All right.
I'd have
I'm
to
just,
check it out.
I'm curious about that. We can hit that one on the next one. I thought that might be a little, and I'm honestly not sure if that's, if there's potentially ground we don't want to go down there, if we shouldn't be talking about
That's a
flashing
good
different
question. I
firmware.
honestly I've never even thought about it.
That'd be interesting. So, okay.
Huh. I mean, at that
So
point, you're running into licensing, right?
I would imagine, right? That's where that would really go. Okay.
Right. So
Okay. So then, all right. So zooming back out to kind of try to, so we just talked acronyms involving PX more than I've ever thought I wanted to here. So
we
again, in
didn't
terms of,
cover some of the other ones. There's a CPX, right, which is the container-based one that only does load balancing, right? We didn't pull back the veil.
run me through it.
Didn't talk about this at all, right? It was, so the container-based one is it runs in Docker and it only does certain things like load balancing.
Interesting.
There's a BLX, which is you actually install the packet engine on like a Linux box, which is,
Okay.
I've never seen that, and I'd be interested to see it. But again, that I don't think it has all the bells and whistles either. Again,
Okay.
it's one of those things that I've never touched one in production. So
Okay, so in terms of what people are most likely going to run into, they're probably going to run into VPXs deployed on an on-prem hypervisor. They're going to run into SDXs racked in their data centers or MPXs racked in their data
correct.
centers. That's the majority. Okay.
Yep.
And these are all just, again, big platforms for running essentially the NetScaler software, right? The ADC, the VPX itself, for doing everything from SSL offload, load balancing to VPN gateways and all this kind of thing. Okay.
Right. SDXs actually can run some third-party third-party appliances, and then it can also do the SD-WAN, but we don't generally, again, it's not something we generally see, right?
Okay.
ADCs, they like to run their ADCs, so.
That makes sense. So, all right. So those are ADCs, and they can exist in an environment on their own, right? There's not, strictly speaking, you don't have to have a way to manage them. They all have management interfaces of their own and everything. But I want to swing now over to the other thing we talked about covering earlier, ADMs. So the application delivery managers. Okay. At a super high level, what's an ADM?
Super high level, the ADM, if and this is going to get confusing because it's not ASDX, but if you think of your VPXs as or you even just the ADC line itself as VMware or Zen server, you can think of the ADM as like your Zen your Zen console or your vCenter, right?
Okay.
All your management happens with the ADM, right? The NetScaler or the ADCs are great. They're great tools, but it's kind of like running an ESX host without vCenter, right?
So I was just going to say that. Okay, so using like the VMware analogy, the ADCs are ESX. The ADM is vSphere.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the ADM allows you to do all of the functionality that you're missing inside your ADCs, right? Sorry, your VPXs, because the SDXs can do email alerting and things like that, but your VPXs themselves, they're not configured, and they don't have the capability out of the box to do any sort of alerting or monitoring or anything like that. You have to send it to a SIM or an SNMP or a syslog, anything like that. Your ADM, however, once you connect your ADM up to your ADCs, your NetScalers, then some things start happening automatically, especially even with just the base express version of ADM. Some things start happening automatically. You start getting alerts put into your console, right, into your ADM console. Audit logging starts happening. Automated backups start happening. You start getting SSL cert expiry alerts. Those type of things happen once you get your ADM plugged into your ADCs.
Okay. So then stepping back, so we're talking a management appliance, and not required for the ADCs or the VPXs, SDXs, MP, not required for them to do what they do, but a significant manageability and functionality add to an environment that's already got them. Okay, so then, and I want to talk about specifically all the stuff that they bring, but in terms of, again, I've got a couple of, turns out we have a pair of SDXs. We got one in data center A and one in data center B, and they've got some number of VPXs on them. I want to bring in an ADM to start sort of be the umbrella that covers these things. What are the options for deploying an ADM either into an environment, or there's probably a cloud version? How what's the breakdown there look like?
So there's two different flavors. There's the on-prem version, right, which is, again, it's a Linux appliance, right? It's built off of the infrastructure of the VPXs, but it is an on-prem appliance. Or you have the cloud version, right? The cloud version uses an agent to talk back to on-prem stuff, to collect the data and send it up into the Citrix cloud.
Okay, so even on the cloud version, because I hear agent and I think, software on an endpoint. Agent in terms of in the Citrix world, this is still an appliance that gets deployed into the data center.
Yeah, when you're talking Citrix Cloud, there you have to have a point of presence back in your data center, and that's either going to be a separate ADM agent that runs. It's a Linux appliance built off of the VPX infrastructure, the VPX backbone, or you can actually run the ADM. There's an ADM application, an ADM agent that lives on your newer ADCs that you can plug in direct and talk directly to the Citrix Cloud. We've been deploying the ADM agent appliances separately because it's not updating agents on production equipment
that makes sense.
Because it can update that agent anytime it wants at that point, right? So we do a separate agent VM deployment just so that we can, we're not disrupting prod. It does all of its own updates on its own. It reboots when it wants to. We don't have to touch it then. It's totally, yeah.
So once that's out, so I want to use, obviously lots of folks, I want to go to the cloud because it all flows to management. There's all the standard reasons for cloud in general. Even though you have to deploy an on-prem virtual appliance as the agent for ADM cloud, once it's deployed, is it pretty much hands off? You said it auto updates, it does all its stuff all on its own.
Just make sure it's running, right? And talking to everything. And you can check the status of it in the ADM cloud. Your other option, the ADM agent is critical to an HA or a DR deployment, even with ADM on-prem, right? Because the ADM on-prem, you're only going to run that ADM on-prem in one data center because of the size of that ADM on-prem potential, right? The potential size of that could be...
Oh, the database of the actual, like all the traffic logs and stuff?
Yeah, so, you start thinking about if you've got, a couple different virtual servers throwing analytics into that ADM across a couple data centers, then you're starting to look at, we've got some folks that are running like 500 gig databases, right? And when you start running those things on-prem and you start putting those into an HA configuration, you have 500 gigs traveling the network, right? And yes, it's good to have it on-prem. It's useful to have it on-prem, but we've seen a lot more success with ADM Cloud.
Well, and again, sort of from the perspective of, the average person here, right, who's gotten handed this environment, like, congratulations, figure it out, and are looking for easy ways to lessen their administrative burden. Because most of these, like, I've already got a job. I'm already a Citrix administrator. I've already got people screaming about their apps and all the other things that I manage. I've now got these NetScalers that I have to deal with, these ADCs, and I want to lessen the amount of work. Deploying an ADM in general is going to help, but you're saying, like, deploying it on-prem just from an infrastructure management perspective is going to then create sort of a whole new set of tasks just from an infrastructure management perspective versus doing it in cloud. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, because you have, it's not, as far as I know, I don't think it auto updates like the cloud does, which means that you'll have to run firmware upgrades on it, and there's downtime with that. We see that there's the functionality in the cloud, the AI they've got new AI and analytics that are in the cloud that aren't coming to on-prem. And then also that on-prem, again, that on-prem ADM, if you're running a lot of traffic through it, it can be a real beast, right? It can take up a lot of resources. So
Okay.
we see it a lot less resource utilization with the ADM cloud,
Okay.
even with agents.
And so, all right, so and that makes a ton of sense from a deployment perspective. So then, if I don't have ADM today, and we mentioned sort of that ESX vSphere comparison, what, just out of the gate, I deploy ADM, say in the cloud. We'll assume in the cloud for the rest of this conversation. So we deploy ADM in the cloud. We got our appliance, our agent on-prem, and we hook up, we said we got 2 SDXs. We hook our SDXs up to it, or maybe just a bunch of VPXs. What are we immediately getting out of the gate from that ADM once we start hooking all our NetScalers into it?
Once you start hooking your NetScalers into it, getting some of the base configurations done, the Express version, even without the analytics, has a ton of functionality, right? We've got the monitoring it can do, the alerting it can do. It alerts for any audit changes, up and downs,
Okay.
all the things you're missing from the log that lives on the NetScaler. That all gets put into ADM at that point, and then you get emails. You can get email alerts, or they've got Teams alerts now. There's a ton of different types of alerts you get for these. You can have it create its own tickets, right? If you have a ticketing system, you can have it do all that. On top of that, you get automated backups, right? So
Like all the configs and stuff on
all
the
the
ADC?
config.
Okay.
You can do a full backup, so it'll back up not only configs but also certs, the entire config, right? So if you need to redeploy, it includes style books, which are automation and orchestration, so that you could do things like firmware updates through style books, right? You can schedule a firmware update without having to manually sit there and watch it do a firmware update.
Okay.
SSL cert changes through style books, virtual servers. Style books it's just a framework, right? So you can use that, and there's a GitHub for style books, right? That you can build out load balancers, add firewall rules, everything.
Okay. All right. So we've got, okay. So then I'm just listening to everything you said there. So all of that stuff, we could talk about all of it in more depth, is not really present on the VPX or on the ADCs themselves.
No, none of that is. No automated backups. It doesn't. I mean, if you make an audit change on it, unless you set up a syslog somewhere, that audit stays on that NetScaler. Like the audit log on the NetScaler shows that change, but no one else will, right? Unless you're doing SNMP, right, to like a SolarWinds or a Splunk or some other SIM, you're not getting any data out of that NetScaler.
Right? Okay. Well, so from a data and alerting perspective, then, so just on that one item, because that's obviously, that'd be a huge reason, sounds like, to go the ADM route. You could do that, or hook up to some other third-party SIM, like
you can, yeah,
QRadar,
yeah.
Splunk, or any of these.
Yeah, but then you're at the mercy of whoever runs that SIM, right? To be able to get alerts out of it, you've got to set up your own rules at that point, right? With the ADM, you can set up one rule that says if anything comes in from this NetScaler from this virtual server, then send me an alert, or don't send alerts during this time. If you wanted to do scheduled maintenance outages, that there's the configuration, you're more in charge of the configuration on the ADM than you would be like a Splunk or a SolarWinds.
Okay. Is there I'm just thinking, like, lots of organizations have got huge both time and money investments and also security investments in an existing on-prem SIM, something like, let's just say Splunk, right, for our purposes. Are you getting something, I think maybe you just answered this, but are you getting something out of the SIM functionality of the ADM that you're not going to get out of a third-party SIM? And is there a reason that you would ever have both? Or if you've got one, is there no reason to use the other?
No, you can use both. So to get a little technical on NetScaler, right? there's at least two packet. There's at least two cores that you give an ADC, not an ADM, an ADC, so that one core is doing management, so sending SNMP, sending syslogs to whatever multiple sites if we need to. That core is always doing that, and the other core is always managing packets. So we could send that SIM SNMP data to 14 different, SolarWinds boxes if we wanted to. It shouldn't affect data at all. Yeah, we shouldn't have any problems with sending it. We see this all the time with people migrating to a different ADM or a different SIM. Right, we've got multiple ADMs in there all the time.
Okay, all right. So that's all on the sort of alerting and analytics side of the world. With that functionality, obviously, nothing is free these days. So with an ADM, again, I've gotten handed a bunch of VPXs and I want to manage them better. ADM sounds like this is sort of a no-brainer. So at what part of this is free, free as in beer? What part of this is free? And at what point do I have to start appropriately, right, paying Citrix in some way?
Sure. They've been messing with the ADM licensing now for a while, but it seems like they've settled at giving you 2 analytics licenses along with the Express version. The Express version gives you nearly everything from a management standpoint. The licenses themselves, the ADM specific licenses, are really only for the analytics portion, right? The extra stuff, the really to help you troubleshoot the problems you might be having, right? So when you apply an analytics license to a virtual server or an application, then you start getting really important data out of it. So the general ones that we do for Express deployments is going to be, it's always going to be the Access Gateway or the Citrix Gateway, right? Because if we're monitoring the Citrix Gateway, we're going to get metrics out coming in and out of it, more metrics than we would be getting out of just Director or the NetScalers, the ADCs directly. Along with that, when you start doing analytics for like an SSL VPN or somebody using EPA, right, the Enterprise Policy Agent, so that you're checking the machines to see if they're on the domain or if they've got the antivirus updated or not. Without the ADM, you have to actually go into ADC logs and look and see why those are failing. When you're monitoring those gateways with an ADM, then there's an actual GUI page that says, hey, this person failed their EPA, and here's why they failed it, right? So they add that functionality into ADM outside of ADC.
Okay, so
that's part of that added value to those virtual servers, those analytics, right? The analytics can do security analytics as well. So if you have an application on there, it'll do security checks against it. Those are the extras that you can get with the analytics licensing. They give you 2 right out of the box, the newest versions. Outside of the 2, they come in packs of 100. So it's really, it's kind of.
I mean, that's a bunch. So you're either going to be, but okay, in terms of what's out of the box, you mentioned Express, and then just to kind of recover and make sure that I've got this right in my head. So when you say the from a management perspective, the Express functionality is free and is always free, or rather is free and remains free. And that, when we say the management functionality, we're talking about like the automated backups, all the alerting stuff that comes out of it, style books, scheduled upgrades, backups.
Everything's included, yeah.
Okay, so that's no cost, right?
Yep.
That's roll out, deploy the ADM agent in the data center, roll out ADM cloud, and now hook all my VPXs up. I've now got, I've got my rear covered in terms of backups and some auditing around config changes without any dollars changing hands.
Correct. Okay. Including some of the network reporting. So you can do daily, weekly, monthly reports, right? The who's connected, how much bandwidth you're using, all of that, right? The orchestration on top of it, the upgrade stuff, that's included with it as well. And then the pooled licensing part is huge one of the main reasons that they're keeping this express version, right?
So we had a question that was around pooled licensing, and I want to get to that. I still want to keep the questions at the end here, but we had one around that specifically.
Okay. Yeah, we can definitely cover that.
So, all right, so we've got, so from a cost perspective, just to sort of wrap that part of the conversation, unless an organization has a lot of VIPs, right, or a lot of functionality that they really need in-depth analytics on, again, can roll out an ADM essentially no cost, or even if they just have a couple, if you've got like a core storefront VIP that you want to monitor, that could be covered. You could get the in-depth analytics piece still for free because it would be covered under one of those two
Correct.
free advanced licenses that comes. Okay.
Yeah, and that's cloud or on-prem, right? So 2 is cloud or on-prem at this point. It used to be with the older versions of ADM on-prem, you could go up to like, I think it was 30, but that's, you know, we're with security implications and things like that these days, we're just straight up go to the newest version, take your lumps, get the 2, and then if you have to buy the pack, right?
Okay. All right. So I think I'm almost out of stupid questions for you, but we have a lot that have come in here on chat and stuff. So we got about 15 minutes left here, give or take. I want to try to get through some of these. Okay, right out of the gate. So this is going to licensing a little bit, and this isn't the big pooled license question. So in terms of licensing, is traffic limited to the license purchased? Seems like in the past, when you got a VPX, it had some certain amount of gig worth of traffic at no charge, but then you had to license to open up more throughput.
Yeah, so that's pay as you grow. That's still a thing, right? Tri-scale is what they called it at one point as well. The new thing is our zero capacity licensing, and that's what we talked about, pooled licensing on the ADM. And I think this was one of the other questions we had outside of the Q&A as well, right?
Yep.
Everybody's kind of wondering how that zero capacity and pooled licensing works, right? So
absolutely, yeah.
That
came in before the call, yeah.
Yeah, that's the new model that Citrix is going to. We want to try to look at that more and more, because it's actually it's easier to manage for sure. What you do now, instead of the way it is today, right, or the way it is with your perpetual licenses, you license it based off the MAC address of the VPX or the MPX or whatever, and that becomes a pain because you still have to do that on a regular basis sometimes, or if you change your MAC address, whatever. With the pooled licensing or in capacity licensing, right? You point your VPXs, MPXs, SDXs to your ADM, either on-prem or in the cloud, either one. Now your ADM is your license server. So if that license, you apply that license through there. If you need to, when you use capacity licensing, that's a whole different model now. You get away from that pay as you grow, right? Because you can change your capacity on a VPX through that ADM console, reboot it, and you're running the higher bandwidth now, right? You don't have to necessarily worry about specific hardware anymore, right? It's all capacity, it's all pooled licensing.
Okay. No, that I think that makes sense on both of those then. So, all right, here's another one on. Okay, so can ADM monitor VPXs running in VMware, or do you have to have an SDX running your VPXs?
No, you can monitor ADMs. You can monitor VPXs in any of the pretty much any. It's agnostic, right? So there's an ADM agent it's in the Azure marketplace. So if you have ADCs that live in Azure, you can deploy an ADM agent from the Azure marketplace and have it connected up to ADM cloud in no time. So yeah, you can have it talk. ADM has the ability to talk to pretty much VPX, MPX, SDX. It can talk to, well, any of the NetScaler line, ADC line. It can also talk to some third parties, some third-party load balancers.
Okay. All right. let's see, where's the next question? Does the ADM have the ability to show reports of what users have logged in the last X hours, the last certain number of hours?
Yeah, it does. I believe it does. I think I ran that for somebody recently. It would be under network reporting, and you can set it up to. Well, that's a good question. Actually, we'd have to check. If they have the analytics set up for that, for whatever gateway.
Oh, for whatever it is they're trying to monitor, you'd have
Yep.
to have probably the advanced analytics. So one of those 2 free or some additional license.
I would have to double check because all
Okay.
of mine has the analytics turned on for that.
Okay.
So I would have to double check. But the network reporting, the network reporting functionality is vast, right? It'll still pull usernames out of whatever the NS log or messages are from the ADCs. So you'll still be able to run reports based off of usernames or whatever constraints, regardless of analytics.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a couple minutes left here. So a few came in. I want to hit a couple of the ones that came in before the session here. At a very high level, what does the process look like if I've got an HA pair of VPXs and they didn't specify VPXs, SDXs? Let's assume it's a pair of SDXs, and they're doing some relatively, pedestrian load balancing. What does, if we have an active passive pair, right? I guess an HA pair. What does, at a high level, what's the upgrade sequence look like for most organizations on something like that?
Yeah. So outside of ADM, if you're just doing a manual HA pair upgrade, right? We would upgrade our passive side, right? Reboot it, make sure it comes up cleanly, log into it, make sure everything's good, fail over to to the passive side, which is now active, right? And it's now running the newer firmware. Sessions should be stateless. There should be a session ID with them that when you whenever you force failover, those sessions should go over.
Of course, that's the favorite word. Yep.
To the new ADC, or the newly upgraded ADC. It should be pretty transparent to users. Now there is functionality in the newer ADCs that allows you to leave users where they are and drain users off as they go. Yeah, I haven't really done that one yet, but the one time I tried it didn't seem to work. But generally what we would do at that point is everyone's running on the new primary, right? That's when we would upgrade the secondary or let it sit for a week just to bake in.
Yeah.
Right. Then we would upgrade our primary, and if we need to, fail it back from there. But generally, it's
well, that was going to be sort of my tail on to this. So out of the gate, no ADM required to update an HA pair.
Mm-mm.
Okay. And if you did get in the scenario, so we update our secondary becomes primary. Now we've got disparate versions, the old primary, now the new secondary is on the older version. Obviously, if we find something wrong at that point, you just cut them back over, do a postmortem. What if you get to the point where you've updated both of your pair now, and you find out that something has gone sideways? Is there a rollback path?
You can
for those.
Generally, there's not a huge problem with rolling back. Generally, yeah, we haven't. I did one recently from a 13.1 to 13.0. So generally, we can do that. It's not such a problem right now. It might be once the 13.1 advanced policy stuff starts hitting, which again, that'll be something further down the road for us, because there's some big changes coming in ADC, right? From 13.0 to 13.1, they're getting rid of the basic policy engine. Again, this is more advanced, but
yeah,
some of the things that work in 13.0 currently will not work in 13.1. So that's one of the reasons that you and I talked about starting this whole thing, is to get moving on that path. But generally, we haven't seen a problem with rolling back. Now, there are some like you don't want to roll back to like an 11.1 or 11.0
Oh, sure.
anymore. Those
Yeah.
are end of life. But yeah, you should be able to roll back to whatever version, as long as it's a pretty recent version. You should be able to roll back, no problem.
Okay.
Yeah, those the VPXs. Again, I'm not going to get super technical with it, but when you start it up, there's a tarf. There's like a what they call the kernel file. That kernel file expands everything in Etsy. Like all of it builds the OS on the fly whenever you start the machine up, right? So it's pretty much the same as it is every time it starts up. And whenever it starts up, it just loads that config file, right? And
Okay.
that's got all of your settings in it. So as long as that config hasn't changed a whole lot between the two versions, you shouldn't have any problems rolling back.
Okay. And that, so that goes, I mean, there's a follow on there that I guess then as long as you have that config file, your VPXs are interchangeable.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, obviously IP schemes and all that, and the MAC addresses and licensing and everything, but you're not gonna lose 5 years of development building out load balancers as long as you've got that config file.
Correct.
Okay. So there was another question that I am going to put off. I just wanted you to know that we weren't ignoring it. There's a question around the new zero trust architecture. That's a huge conversation. Matt and I were talking about that before. We are going to do a round 2 of this whole conversation to talk in a lot more depth about everything NetScaler here. Matt and I could talk for days about this stuff. So we are going to do another one. I am going to wrap this one here just because we're right at an hour. I think we promised everybody this would be about an hour long. So just a couple things before everyone starts to split. First of all, obviously, Matt, man, thank you so much for hopping on and doing this with us. This has been hugely enjoyable for me. I've learned a ton. I hope everyone else has learned a ton too. Obviously, for everyone on, if you've got an ADC and found a lot of this useful, working through a health check or something similar with us would probably be very beneficial. Typically, when organizations, off ADC management and hand it over, I'm going to try to be nice here. It's highly likely the ADC is probably not in the greatest shape in the world. And having somebody like Matt or one of our other folks take a look at it will be a very good place to start. If you're not a current customer, obviously you can reach us info@alchemytechgroup.com. If you are a current customer, reach out to your account rep, harass them, tell them what you need, make them buy lunch and all that good stuff. We are going to be sending out, like we did on the last one, there's going to be a survey coming out after this, just with a quick, I think it's 2 or 3 questions, making sure that we're still swinging in the strike zone in terms of what you all want to see from these in the lab sessions. And otherwise, I think that's about it. Again, Matt, man, thank you so much for hopping on, and everyone out there, thank you so much for joining us. This has been great.
My pleasure.
Have a good one, everybody.